The dented gray pickup sat at the edge of the bank's private parking lot, like a stain on a white tablecloth, and Patricia Vance noticed it the second she stepped out of her Mercedes. Its bumper was held on with a bungee cord. One headlight was taped over with yellowed plastic. In the truck bed, a toolbox sat next to a child's pink bicycle helmet, wedged between two sawhorses, and on the dashboard, visible through the windshield, was a stack of unpaid bills, clipped together with a binder clip that had lost its shape years ago. Patricia didn't know whose truck it was. She didn't care. At 51, she had built her reputation on exactly two things: precision and intolerance, for anything that looked like it didn't belong. As regional vice president of Holloway Trust Bank's flagship branch, she had spent 15 years making sure that everything visible from the lobby windows projected exactly one message: that this was a bank for people who had already arrived, not people who were still trying to get there. She pulled out her phone and called the front desk. "There's a truck in the reserved clients section. Get it towed now." She didn't ask who it belonged to. She didn't check the visitor log. She simply assumed, the way she always assumed, that nothing that looked like that truck could possibly belong to anyone who mattered inside her building. 20 minutes later, a flatbed pulled the truck away, its tires screeching faintly against the curb as it banked onto the main road. Patricia watched from her office window on the third floor, arms folded, satisfied, the way a person feels satisfied after pulling a weed. She had no idea that within the hour, she would be standing in the lobby herself, apologizing to a man she had just publicly humiliated, while 4 members of the bank's board of directors listened in stunned silence. If you believe people deserve to be judged by their character and not their car, their clothes, or their bank balance, type "I agree" in the comments before this story continues. And if stories like this move you, stories about quiet dignity, about being underestimated, about the moment truth finally catches up to arrogance, subscribe to Kindness Tales. We tell these stories because too many people in this world are still being measured by the wrong yardstick. Now here's what Patricia didn't know. The truck belonged to a man named Gabriel Reyes, and Gabriel had been having a hard year, though hard year didn't really cover it. Gabriel was 43 years old, a structural engineer by training, and a single father by circumstance. A circumstance he hadn't chosen and hadn't seen coming. 18 months earlier, his wife Monica had died of a brain aneurysm on a Tuesday afternoon while folding laundry in their bedroom. There had been no warning, no illness. She had simply collapsed, and by the time the paramedics arrived, she was already gone. Gabriel had been at work, 40 minutes away, reviewing blueprints for a parking structure that, in hindsight, he could not remember a single detail of. Since that Tuesday, Gabriel had been raising their daughter, Wren, alone. Wren was 7, she had her mother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, and some mornings, when Gabriel watched her eat cereal at the kitchen counter, he had to leave the room for a minute, because the resemblance hit him like a physical blow. Money had become its own quiet emergency. Monica's life insurance had been smaller than they'd planned for. They'd meant to update the policy after Wren was born, and never had. The mortgage on their small house in a fading suburb outside the city was manageable, barely, if Gabriel didn't think too hard about anything else. Wren's school needed supplies. Wren needed shoes that fit, since 7-year-old's feet apparently grew overnight. There was a leak in the bathroom ceiling Gabriel had patched 3 times with the wrong materials, because he couldn't afford the right ones. The truck, the one currently being dragged onto a tow platform without his knowledge, had belonged to his father. It had over 200,000 miles on it. It ran on stubbornness and duct tape, in roughly equal measure. Gabriel kept meaning to replace it. He never could justify the expense. Wren's college fund, what little existed of it, mattered more than a smooth ride. For the past 4 months, Gabriel had been working nights and weekends on something that might finally change things. A private consulting project for Holloway Trust Bank itself, brought to him through a former colleague, who knew the bank was quietly panicking. 3 of their branch buildings, including the flagship location downtown, had developed serious structural issues: foundation settling, hairline fractures spreading through load-bearing walls. 2 engineering firms had already produced reports, and both reports had been vague, expensive, and ultimately useless. The bank was facing the possibility of closing its flagship branch for emergency repairs, A six-figure-a-day problem in lost business, to say nothing of the reputational damage. Gabriel had spent 4 months poring over blueprints, soil reports, and historical data on the building's original 1974 construction. He had identified something the previous firms missed entirely, a flaw in the original foundation design that had been quietly worsening for decades, accelerated by a water table shift nobody had accounted for. He had a plan, not a guess. A plan, with numbers, with phases, with a clear path to stabilizing the building without a full closure. That morning, he had been invited to present his findings directly to the bank's board of directors. It was the kind of meeting that could change everything, stabilize his finances for years, maybe pull him fully out from under the weight he'd been carrying since Monica died. He had pressed his one good shirt the night before. He'd dropped Ren at school early, promising to pick her up himself, instead of having the neighbor do it, because today felt like a day worth celebrating with pizza, win or lose. He arrived at the bank 12 minutes early. He parked in the section the security guard had told him over the phone to use. "Anywhere in the side lot, sir, that's fine for visitors," and walked inside to check in at the front desk. He did not see Patricia. Patricia from her window did not yet know who he was. She only saw the truck. By the time Gabriel had signed in, gotten his visitor badge, and walked back toward the side entrance to grab the second set of blueprints he'd left in the truck was gone. He stood on the curb for a long moment, genuinely confused, scanning the lot as if the truck might simply be hiding behind a hedge. A security guard, young, apologetic in a way that suggested he knew this was unfair but wasn't in a position to say so, told him what had happened. Vehicle in the reserved lot. Ordered removed by Ms. Vance. Procedure once a tow order came down from upper management. Nothing personal. Gabriel felt something tighten behind his sternum, a familiar pressure he'd been carrying around for 18 months, in different shapes and sizes. That truck wasn't just a truck. It carried Ren's car seat in the back when he picked her up from school. It had driven Monica to her last doctor's appointment, the one where everything still seemed routine. It held the blueprints for the presentation he was about to give, the one that represented the first real hope he'd had in over a year. He looked at his watch, 8 minutes until the meeting started. No truck, no way home except whatever he could figure out later, and underneath all of it, the old exhausting feeling of being dismissed before anyone had bothered to ask who he was. He didn't argue with the guard, there was no point. He straightened his jacket, took a breath the way he'd learned to take breaths over the last year and a half. The kind that didn't fix anything, but kept you upright. And walked back inside. The boardroom on the 14th floor had floor-to-ceiling windows, and a long mahogany table that probably cost more than Gabriel's truck, several times over. 6 board members sat along one side. Patricia Vance sat at the head, sharp in a charcoal suit, a woman who radiated the specific confidence of someone who had never once, in her professional life, wondered if she belonged in the room. She did not recognize Gabriel. Why would she? She had glanced at a truck from a third-floor window, not at the man standing beside it. The meeting opened with a junior associate, summarizing the building's structural reports. Vague, hedging language, numbers that didn't quite add up to a plan. Worried faces around the table. Then Patricia turned toward Gabriel, introduced him by name only. "This is the independent consultant," and gestured for him to begin. Gabriel opened his laptop and began to speak. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't perform confidence the way some consultants did, padding their findings with jargon meant to obscure, rather than clarify. He simply explained, clearly and methodically, what the previous firms had missed. The water table data nobody had cross-referenced. The original soil composition reports, buried in a county archive, that took him 3 weeks to track down. The specific section of the original 1974 blueprints, where a cost-cutting decision, made 50 years earlier, had created a slow-motion structural problem that was only now becoming serious. He walked them through a phased stabilization plan, no full closure required. 11 weeks of targeted reinforcement work, conducted in sections, with the branch remaining open the entire time. A cost roughly 40% below what the previous firms had projected for a far less effective fix. Questions came from around the table, pointed, skeptical at first, the kind of questions people ask when they suspect they're being sold something. Gabriel answered everyone without hesitation, pulling up supporting data, cross-referencing his own findings against historical records he'd spent weeks digging up. He wasn't selling anything. He was simply right, and it showed. Patricia's posture began to shift somewhere around the 15-minute mark. She'd been the kind of executive who could read a room instantly, and the room had changed. The skepticism around the table had curdled into something closer to relief, even excitement. This wasn't a man hoping to be taken seriously. This was the answer they'd been searching for, since the first crack appeared in a basement wall 8 months ago. And then it happened. One of the board members, an older man named Holloway, the bank's founder's grandson, glanced down at Gabriel's visitor badge, then up at his face, then said, almost offhand, "You drove here today? Hope the parking wasn't a hassle." Gabriel paused. A small humorless smile crossed his face. "Actually it was. My truck got towed about 20 minutes ago. Apparently, it didn't belong in the reserved lot." The room went quiet in that specific way. Rooms go quiet when something has just clicked into place that nobody wants to say out loud. Patricia felt the blood leave her face. She didn't need anyone to explain it to her. She remembered the truck from the window. The bungee cord bumper, the taped headlight, the toolbox in the back. She remembered making the call without checking a single thing. And now the man standing at the front of her boardroom, the man who had just potentially saved the bank from a structural and financial catastrophe, was the same man whose truck she'd had hauled away 45 minutes earlier, because it didn't look like it belonged. "That was your truck," she said. It wasn't really a question. "That was my truck," Gabriel confirmed evenly, no anger in his voice, just fact. Holloway looked between the two of them, then around the table, where several board members were doing very poor jobs of hiding their reactions. "Patricia," he said slowly, "did you have this man's vehicle towed?" She didn't answer right away. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of answer. What followed wasn't dramatic in the way movies make these moments dramatic. There was no shouting. But the temperature in the room changed completely. A board member quietly excused herself to find out which towing company had been used, and how fast the truck could be returned. Another asked, not unkindly but pointedly, whether this was the kind of judgment the bank wanted, representing its flagship branch. Holloway, to his credit, didn't say much at all. He simply watched Patricia waiting. Patricia stood. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt the specific discomfort of being seen clearly by people whose opinion of her mattered. She turned to Gabriel. "I'm sorry," she said. "I made an assumption about you based on a truck in a parking lot, and I was wrong. Not just about the truck, about you." Gabriel listened without flinching, without performing forgiveness he didn't yet feel. "I appreciate that," he said simply. "I need to get back for my daughter soon though. She's 7. I told her I'd pick her up myself today." Something in the way he said it, quiet, unembellished, no attempt to leverage the moment, seemed to land harder on the room than any complaint could have. A single father, towed out of a parking lot on the day he was trying to save their building, worried more about getting back to his kid than about being owed an apology. Patricia herself made the calls, not an assistant. Not security. She tracked down the towing company, paid the release fee personally, and arranged for the truck to be driven back and parked directly at the building's front entrance. Washed, fueled, and waiting. By the time the meeting wrapped up 40 minutes later, when Gabriel walked out of the building, 3 board members walked with him, not out of obligation, but because something about the morning had genuinely shifted something in them. Holloway shook his hand at the curb and said, in front of everyone, that the bank would be lucky to have him on a long-term retainer. Not as a one-time consultant, but as someone they trusted to oversee the work from start to finish. The truck sat there at the curb, bungee cord and all, looking exactly the same as it had 2 hours earlier, except now it was parked in the spot usually reserved for the bank's armored cash transport vehicle. Nobody moved it, nobody suggested otherwise. If you believe people shouldn't be judged by what they drive, type character over appearance in the comments. Some of you have lived this exact moment. Maybe not with a truck, but with an old coat, a worn-out car, a tired face that made someone assume the wrong thing about you before you ever opened your mouth. We see you. 3 weeks later, Gabriel signed a 2-year retainer agreement with Holloway Trust Bank, the largest single contract of his career. He paid off the remaining balance on the roof repair he'd been putting off. He started, finally, a real college fund for Ren, the kind with actual contributions instead of good intentions. He did not buy a new truck. People asked him about that sometimes. Colleagues, mostly, once word of the story made its way around the office, as these things do. Why keep driving a 23-year-old truck with 200,000 miles on it, when he could afford something newer? Something that wouldn't need a bungee cord to hold the bumper on? Gabriel never had a complicated answer. The truck had been his father's. It had carried Monica to appointments she didn't know would be her last. It had carried Ren home from the hospital, the day she was born. Some things weren't about what they were worth. They were about what they'd carried. Patricia changed too, in ways that were harder to see from the outside, but real nonetheless. She started asking questions before making calls she used to make without thinking. She mentioned Gabriel's name more than once, in meetings. Not as an apology she kept performing, but as a reference point. A reminder to herself. Ren got her pizza that night, the kind with too much cheese, eaten at the kitchen counter while her dad told her, in the simplified way you tell a 7-year-old about your day, that things were going to be a little easier from now on. She didn't fully understand why. She just knew her dad seemed lighter than he had in a long time, and that was enough for her. And every morning, Gabriel still drove the same old truck to drop Ren off at school, bungee cord and all, a little slower than it used to be, a little louder when it idled, but still running, still carrying what mattered most, exactly the way it always had. If this story reminded you that worth isn't something you can see from a parking lot, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to Kindness Tales for more stories about the moments when truth finally catches up to judgment.